So, slavery in the South is obviously key to economic prosperity for many white Southerners. A common misperception of slavery is that it did not exist in the North, and that's far from the truth. Slavery did exist in cities, in northern cities at that, and even when slavery eventually would be abolished in northern states, things were not good for free black people. Okay? So, this notion that slavery didn't exist up north is not true. However, it wasn't anywhere near as prevalent as it was in the South, and that is a reality. However, though, some realities of slaves in the city. Uh, it's really hard to supervise slaves in the city. They're not out working the fields and picking cotton or doing anything else along those lines. They're oftentimes doing common labor type jobs or working in lumber mills or mining, or they're working on docks or construction sites. They're driving wagons or otherwise working unskilled labor. It's hard to supervise that quite as often because they can be spread out. The working hours, typically they were, different than out on the plantation. Typically they had a little bit more freedom to move about. And so slavery in the city kind of dissipated as it was thought that maybe slaves would be able to rebel a bit more if they were more free, if that makes sense. That kind of adds to the idea of there being free slaves or free black people. Okay, free slaves is contradictory. Um, the idea of there being African Americans who were free and had their freedom, even some in the South, did happen. There were about 250,000 of them. Typically, they're in the upper South, like around Virginia or so. They might sometimes have earned enough money in whichever way to maybe purchase their freedom, or they were set free by their master's own goodwill. That happened a reasonable amount. Okay. Some masters feared a slave rebellion, so they set their slaves free. And otherwise, though, there was a growing free black population. And then, of course, you have abolitionists, largely from the North, who wanted to abolish slavery altogether. And there were all kinds of different things in the South going on to kind of prevent that movement from happening. Various different laws were placed into effect to prevent masters from freeing their slaves or anything else of the sort. So you have black society, which oftentimes is unevenly distributed. So the slave trade itself was a whole economy, if you will. There was a whole industry where people bought and sold slaves as commodities. So nowadays, you might be able to go to a car dealership and you're buying a car, or you can go to an auto auction. There's a car available for auction, and you put in your bid, and if you have the highest bid, then okay, you're going to get that. That's what happened with slaves. There was a whole industry of transferability of slaves, largely dependent upon a market of slaves to be bought and sold at auction. This happened. There are actual businesses, brick and mortar businesses, that advertise how they're involved in slave labor. That really happens. And it was something that was done, made front and center, not just to advertise, hey, this is a prospective business opportunity, here's where you can buy slave labor, that sort of a thing. Psychologically, it was also done somewhat to dehumanize African slaves. It's meant to dehumanize black people so as to kind of reinforce their status and inferiority, if you will. That's something that's done deliberately. And so, from that perspective, there's an even more sinister aspect of slaves in the slave trade. You're not just doing it for profit, you're doing it to send a message. And the reality is, the entire Southern economy is based upon slave labor. You have to do these sorts of things. If you are a plantation owner, if you're a slave owner, you have to perpetuate stereotypes about black people to keep them in their status because your entire way of life, your entire economic value is based upon slave labor being cheap and accessible. You have to perpetuate it. So even if you don't necessarily believe that black people are inferior, you have to perpetuate that stereotype until it becomes truth. Does that make sense? Because that's a reality of the slave trade, the domestic slave trade. So the United States could no longer import slaves directly from Africa after 1808. I mentioned that, but otherwise, though, the domestic slave trade played a massive part in breaking up black families. So if you see African American society today, you see quite a number of single moms, broken homes, broken families. That was ingrained in African American culture in our slave days. That's that's not a new or made up phenomenon. That goes back decades, centuries. It's ingrained. To this day, we are still working out a lot of the old slave mentality, a lot of the discrimination unto black people. We've come a long way, but we still have a ways to go for black people to be truly integrated into our society. And it's been a long road. Okay? So these ideas of slave trades meant not just for commodities, but also to reinforce that message. And then, of course, you have the aspect of slave resistance. Well, you're a slave. Boy, wouldn't you like not to be a slave? I know I would. If I were a slave, I'd try and resist whichever way possible. I'd try and um, break out of my slavery if at all possible. That's human nature. So the idea that there may be slave rebellions and a resistance, that's only natural. I don't blame any of them. Okay? Most slaves obviously didn't want their situation. They wanted to be free. They wanted to be emancipated. Okay? Um, you have a number of different publications that talk about this, especially coming from the abolitionist side. And then, of course, you also have slave rebellions organized by slaves, like Nat Turner, for example, in in the 1830s in Southampton, Virginia. Nat Turner organized a slave rebellion and killed quite a number of white people, about 60 or so. And that caused a backlash unto slaves themselves that actually saw more slaves killed than white people were killed. People getting killed is never the answer, but that's kind of human nature. So that's the unfortunate aspect, and because black folks were oftentimes threatening to rebel, that made it more harsh for them on the onset for people to keep them around. It made it more pertinent for white slave owners to maintain their slave status, being harsher on them, shackle them even more. So black people oftentimes when they were enslaved, if they needed permission to leave, um, they oftentimes had to have some sort of permit or anything else like that. And any black person that didn't have a permit on them was perceived to be a runaway. Just because you look suspicious, you don't have your specific documentation, you could be a slave. You're running away. So conditions were very harsh for slaves. So oftentimes they would resist in other different ways. So maybe if you're on the plantation, maybe you just refuse to work. Refuse to work hard. Whip me. Okay. Maybe you steal something here and there, a piece of equipment from your master. Maybe you do some other things. Maybe you accidentally broke your pick, your tools, or anything else of the sort. Okay? You broke your working equipment. Oh, I can't work today. This broke. Sometimes they would commit suicide. Sometimes they would try and kill their overseer or their master themselves. It's human nature. A lot of times, a friend of mine once explained this to me one time. about he's a black guy, and he talked about how he's frustrated sometimes with some of his family members who they don't always get along with cops, and of course there's the whole tenuous relationship, Black Lives Matter and whatnot with the police and that sort of thing. Black culture has a long history with that situation. I won't get into details, but he talked about how sometimes things were perpetuated by his family members themselves. Uh, why can't I steal from this? Yeah, I'm going to steal this guy's hubcaps. Yeah, I'm going to do this. And he classified it as a way to kind of protest against white society. I thought about it a little bit more deeply, and it kind of makes sense. That's kind of an old slave mentality, in a sense that you may be enslaved and you're going to resist, not necessarily by trying to run away or kill people, but you're gonna protest the norm. You're gonna kind of break things here and there to kind of get your message across. That's somewhat ingrained in black society to this day. It's affected by old slave culture. So you have those aspects of slave trade, slave resistance, all of that was going on, and we're going to talk about the actual slave culture itself here shortly.